instance that I want to talk about, and I didn't want to spend all my time on it, but because the Brennan Center got so popular even before I got up here, I did want to mention that I actually agree with you, Chairman, on turnout studies and the limitations on looking at turnout to see how these things affect voters. I believe another witness will mention this in much more detail. If I can, it's up to you. I have 2 more sentences on this particular topic. It is part of why the Brennan Center has not done a study on how photo ID affects turnout, in part because we agree there are many limitations of these sorts of studies. You need a lot of variables over a lot of time in order to come up with a really conclusive answer on how turnout is affected one way or the other. That's absolutely correct, and there'll be other witnesses who I believe will testify to that in much more detail. What we have done is something we think more reliable, which is we've asked the citizens. We've done a survey, and there are others. We're not the only ones who've done a survey. We've asked citizens, do you have X and Y sort of ID? And the answer was most do, but a disturbing number don't. And we're very concerned that anyone, Texas or otherwise, would take action to solve a problem that doesn't exist, but that actually creates a problem for all of those citizens who told us we don't have what you're asking us to get.
Okay. Let me just say thank you. I appreciate the spirit of your testimony. That's far closer to being the kind of oppositional testimony that I expected, and I was a little surprised by Mrs. Troutman's allegation that there is no evidence of any kind of voter fraud of any kind. You do not agree with her on that. Is that correct?
I do not agree with her on that. I don't know about Harris County in particular, or her experience in Harris County.
I understand that. But the fact is that there is substantial amount of evidence of voter fraud, but your position is that only a handful of substantiated cases exist with regard to impersonation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
There's an extensive body of evidence to support the notion of fraud with regard to absentee ballots.
Correct.
And so while we're on that subject, do you have any suggestions on how this committee might be able to get at the area of fraud where there is no disagreement that is out there and is a major problem? Any suggestions on what we do to deal with that?
It is a very sticky issue. One of the things, federal law actually provided one means to get at that, and I believe that the rate of absentee ballot fraud has dropped substantially since 2002. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 requires, and Texas, as I understand, has implemented, a system that in some ways catches absentee ballot fraud. When you register to vote, you're required to give information over. The Secretary of State will try to match that information up to other government lists. If you don't match, then you have to submit some form of identification, the same identification that is now permitted at the polls under Texas law.
Did you identify a state that's currently doing that?
I believe every state, including Texas, is currently doing that. And so those, to some degree, that exists. Another way to get at absentee ballot fraud.
I'm obviously looking for something that we do not currently do because we've got dead people voting. How can we prevent that?
Two items really quickly. One, I'm not sure that you do have dead people voting in anywhere near the numbers that are often cited. You mentioned earlier a Georgia study in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. That one's notorious. It came out in 2000 and said 5,400 dead people. They actually did an investigation. The way they came up with that was through a record matching system that we've shown repeatedly to be flawed. They mentioned one person that the reporter was dead certain had voted while deceased. And they went back and they actually looked. That's why I mentioned the poll book signatures. They looked at the poll book signatures, and it's not the same guy.
So what is the evidence that you agree is out there that is extensive with regard to absentee ballots?
You have situations like in Indiana, where there was massive both coercion of absentee balloters, where there were people applying for absentee ballots. That was before 2002. That was before the Help America Vote Act was implemented. In Miami, the same thing in 1997, before the Help America Vote Act was implemented. The Help America Vote Act has actually done quite a bit to get at that. But the other way you can avoid more absentee ballot fraud is to make it as easy as possible while still maintaining the security of voting at the polls. That is, the harder you make it to vote at the polls, the more people you're going to drive into the absentee ballot system, and the more people you're going to lay out there to the system where it's much harder to actually control against fraud. At the polls, you actually have a reasonable set of safeguards, including people showing up in person and swearing, including signing in, including your being able to see their face, including the ID that, as you mentioned, Texas currently requires, either a registration certificate or one of the broad means of documentary ID.
Okay. You mentioned that the study that you did do, and it's 2.6, 2.9%. You know the study that I'm talking about.
There are several. The one that we did,
And I want to get a specific answer. Was that comparing Indiana to a state that has no identification requirement whatsoever? What was the comparison?
it was not, because we've never done a comparison. What we've done is we've asked
What was
voters.
that 2-point-something% figure? What was it?
I believe that was a study done by, it's possible it was Matt Barreto from the University of New Mexico.
What to what?
It was comparing. No, I'm sorry. Barreto's study was not. It was not a comparison study of state to state. I'm going to leave that question, if I may, for one of the other witnesses who will know this better. I'm not sure.
Okay.
We have done studies of the rate at which citizens have or don't have this, not the turnout.
You agree with me? There's not any study of any kind that would indicate that that would suppress poor, aged, and minority voters, right? You agree with me?
I can't agree with you in part because I don't know all of the details of what was submitted in Arizona. Arizona has a system where you submit one photo ID or two forms of non-photo ID. Okay, that's their basic.
You're not aware of any,
correct.
Are you? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I want you just to explain to me in a little more detail, and then I'll let other members ask questions. You say that you admit that it's hard to find, in terms of hard to prove evidence of voter impersonation.
It may well be hard to prosecute, but I don't believe it's actually hard to find.
Okay, hard to prosecute. And with regard to voter fraud, you agree with me that looking at the extent of prosecution is really not the most accurate way to try to determine the extent to which it occurs. You agree with that, don't you?
Yeah.
Now, the absence of prosecution does not mean that it does not occur. But on the other hand, I will grant you that the absence of prosecution doesn't mean that it does occur either. You agree with that, right?
I think that's accurate. I think there are better metrics to find out whether it does or does not occur.
Okay. And when you say there's always a paper trail at the polls, help me understand that, because my understanding is that, and tell me where I'm wrong, that with regard to an absentee ballot, you've got a much better paper trail because you have an envelope, you have an address, you have a stamp. Whereas at the poll, you primarily have a signature. Whereas on the absentee ballot, you have that, plus you have the envelope and the stamp and the typewriter that typed the information on the outside of the envelope. Well, I guess most of the time that is a state issued document. So I guess you have a stamp and you have a signature and you have an address. Tell me why. Is it true that that paper trail is more extensive than the paper trail at the ballot?
That paper trail is mildly more extensive, but the paper trail at the polls is more than enough to tell you, did somebody vote in that person's name or not? Okay. And that's what we focused on.
So because there is a more significant paper trail with regard to absentee ballot, you would agree that it is at least marginally easier to identify and prosecute than it is at the polls?
Yes.
Okay.
But let's talk about why it's hard to vote for a person who may be deceased using their identity. Let's talk about the mechanics of that, and then let's talk about the mechanics of HAVA and how it's implemented in Texas. Are you aware of how it's implemented here?
I believe so.
Okay, and if you can speak to that, that'd be helpful, because I don't want the impression to be left with the media or the audience or the members of the committee that this is happening on a large scale post-HAVA.
No, that's entirely right. And one clarification, if I may, the reports that have been done post-HAVA, of which I'm aware, deal with allegations that dead people have been found on the rolls or that dead people have voted, and when there's been follow-up. I know there was a notorious case, the Texas Watchdog blog and then the Dallas Morning News later. When there's been follow-up, the follow-up has actually been that dead people have not voted. That is, there are lots of claims, but the claims actually turn out, for the same reason as in Georgia, not to pan out on further investigation. So you'd